Hey everyone, it's Jordan. I'm doing a video on case writing for the 2026 Easter's CAT. Although this is a video that will be focused on case writing, I'm going to talk a little bit about setup as well. I think there are plenty of other videos out there that cover this in more depth. But although these are separated out, I think it's just important to remember what your setup actually is and to come back to it fairly frequently while you're in the case writing process. Because often one of the mistakes that teams make is that they end up creating setup that either doesn't work with their case or they forget to do the setup, which means that their case, in a sense, has no real foundations, which makes it quite weak. So, firstly, in terms of that setup, I think what is important to do here, aside from all of the kind of normal details where you'd think about how this should work, is just to make sure that you have a clear answer to a series of questions. And these are all the classic scene setting questions that you would have covered when you were in school, when you were talking about things like creative writing or writing an essay, right? Like the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, the how. And I know it sounds very basic and childish, but you have to have answers for all of those questions when it comes to the way that your case is going to work, the arguments that you're making, and the types of things that you think the policy or the counterfactual will or will not cause to happen in the debate. So making sure to think about that carefully at the start before you get into case writing will be very valuable. Ideally, when you do it, you'll already have a vague idea of the types of arguments that you think you're going to run. And once you've done that setup, what is helpful for you to do is then come back to those arguments and start to flesh them out. But as you are doing it, make sure to keep that setup in your mind and ask yourself, wait, if I want to run this argument, do I need to change the setup or change the model that we're doing? And is it going to create tension if I try to run this argument with this setup? Because often teams, I think of these as being overly separate when they're very closely interlinked. Setup is the foundation for the case, and it's what your arguments flow naturally from. So you have to make sure that it actually is compatible with them and works with them. Um, what do I mean by this? The first thing is that I think often when it comes to the case, teams just think of it as being separate arguments. But ideally, before you start getting into separate arguments, you want to have a conception of what the principle or principles are that actually support your side of the debate. And what I mean by this is that sometimes people have a habit of trying to, whatever side they're on, always running arguments that flow from the same type of ideology or set of principles or moral beliefs. Like, for instance, if you're a very progressive person, always trying to run really progressive arguments no matter what side of the round you're on. And obviously, this is very tempting because we tend to think that things that we believe in are very persuasive because we've been persuaded by them and we're clever people. But there are many times where in debating, the side of the debate that you're on is going to ask you to run arguments that are contrary to your particular beliefs and your particular principles. And being able to recognize that quickly and to understand that it actually doesn't make sense in this particular case to run those types of arguments. You have to run different types of arguments that flow from different moral beliefs, different philosophical views of the world. That is incredibly important. If you don't do it, you will almost always create weird tensions, weak arguments, and you will have a very like low quality case essentially. So take a step back and ask yourself naturally, what types of people, what types of principles, what types of political parties and views would be the ones that are likely to support my side of the debate? And if the answer is that like your side of the debate is one that appeals to conservatives or one that appeals to libertarians, even if those are not arguments that you would be persuaded by normally, then those are still probably the arguments that you're going to need to run to at least some extent in order to actually have a strong case to win. The second thing is that you want to think about once you have decided what those principles likely look like, then you would come back to your setup and your context and you would ask yourself if those principles are going to come into conflict with it. So, for instance, if one of the elements of your setup is like, we are going to try to help the most vulnerable people, but then you have realized that your side of the debate is actually asking you to do a policy that is likely to be beneficial to the majority of people, but could have harms to minorities, then that element of your setup needs to go. Instead, what you need to do is to actually explain why it is that prioritizing the majority makes sense in this case. You need to, for instance, explain maybe some side benefits or some things that might flow on to other groups or reasons why those other groups are not so harshly affected or why they benefit when the majority does well as well. But you will just have to stick with the principles and the beliefs that would naturally support your side. Don't try to twist them and don't try to run away from them either. The second thing that you then need to do is to obviously think of your arguments. And here often you'll get people who will say things like, well, I get into prep and they think of arguments. And then after the debate, the judge is like, why'd you run those arguments? You should have run these other arguments instead. You've totally missed the debate. And, how do I make sure I stop doing it? Like, how do I run the right arguments? And the answer here is unfortunately very unsatisfying. Like the answer is basically you're running the wrong arguments probably because you have a knowledge problem. And what you need to do is you need to matter prep much more rigorously. And ideally, with the combination of doing more debates where you'll be exposed to hopefully some good arguments, and hopefully some teams that are running good, persuasive, and interesting material, you'll both learn from that experience. You'll learn from the feedback that you get from judges, and hopefully you will also start to learn a little bit from the things that you are reading, what some good and interesting arguments are. And obviously, in line with what I've said earlier, make sure that you're trying to read from a diverse range of sources that represent a diverse range of moral views rather than just things that you agree with. Because you're probably already going to be good at running arguments that you agree with. Often, what people struggle with is running arguments that they don't naturally agree with. Those are perhaps the areas where you need to read more. Then the question is like, okay, once you have some good ideas, how do you actually prove them and make them part of your case in a way that is strong and effective? I think there are two strategies. The first one, and the one that I think is better, is to start from the point of the policy. Ask yourself what the most immediate and direct changes are that it creates in the world. And don't ask yourself this in a way that is like, what are the changes it will create that I like? Or like, what are the changes that it will create that I think are good for me? Instead, just ask yourself, imagining that you're not on any particular side in the debate and you are just an impartial, neutral observer, logically, what are the things that I think that this policy would cause to occur? And then after that, once you have thought that through, then you will think, okay, well, which of these are things that are good for my side and which of them are things that are bad? But you have to start by just having a complete understanding of the changes that the policy will create. So whether that's good things or bad things, you need to understand that. And then what you want to do is follow some of those ideas down a longer chain. So if the debate is something like that we should ban school uniforms, then you would go, okay, well, what is the first thing that happens? The first thing that happens is that we pass some bit of legislation that says schools are not allowed to require you to wear a school uniform anymore. They're not allowed to punish you if you don't wear that uniform. Okay, what follows from that? Well, what follows from that is probably that now parents are not going to think that it is worthwhile to do things like invest in a school uniform or buy a school uniform. Children are not going to want to wear it because kids hate uniforms. They like to express themselves and they often don't like, they might not like the fabrics or the cut or the look of it, or they think it's lame or it's uncool. So that means no one will be wearing a school uniform. Very few people might hold on to their old ones and choose to wear them for some reason. What is important then is then you go, okay, well, that is now what the policy is caused to occur. What happens after that? And then there can be a series of branching paths. Like, for instance, one of the things that might happen could be that students from minority cultural backgrounds will feel more comfortable wearing their traditional clothes at school. Great, that's nice. It could be that what will happen is that students who like to play a lot of sport and like to be really active will wear clothing that is conducive to that. Maybe that means that they run around more and they have more fun at school. Great, that's a benefit. Maybe one of the things that will happen is that students who don't feel comfortable in the types of clothes that the uniform might have required will wear clothes that feel more comfortable for them, whether that's the look or the fabric or the fit. That's good. That means that they'll be more comfortable. Maybe they'll concentrate more in class, or maybe they'll just be happier, and that's perhaps good. Maybe students who feel unconfident in those clothes will wear clothes that make them feel more confident. Perhaps that makes them better at socializing. That might be good as well. And you can see how naturally all of these things stem from that starting point, and you've reasoned your way forwards. You've now arrived at a series of 4 impacts. Good for you. And you can explain that full chain of logic pretty simply and pretty clearly to the judge. The other thing that you can do is you can work your way backwards. So you can go, okay, this debate is like that we should abolish the corporate tax. I feel like this debate is going to be one where on the affirmative, we will have some sort of argument about how GDP will go up, but I don't really understand it and I'm not too sure. So what you can do is you can skip all the way to the end, which is your impact. GDP is going to increase. And then you can think, gee, I'm just not too sure how the policy causes that to occur. And you can work your way backwards as well. So you can go, okay, I think the policy is going to cause GDP to go up. Why would that occur? Well, GDP goes up when, the economy produces more things of value. So that must have been the precursor to this outcome of GDP going up. Somehow the economy is producing more things of value. Okay, what would cause that to occur? Probably it would be that businesses must have been doing some investment or expansion. They're producing either more items or more high value items. Okay, well, what would cause that to occur? They must have somehow had more money and they've used that money to invest in these ways that I've just described. Okay, well, why would they use the money in that way? Maybe because they're subject to competition and they have to do it in order to get ahead of their in order to get ahead of their competitors. That might be a good reason. Maybe it's because many businesses hold debt and they need to increase their value in order to be able to pay back that debt. Maybe it's because many businesses have shareholders and they need to make money in order to pay back their shareholders. So these things then put you at a point where you have now successfully backwards reasoned and you've understood that somehow this policy must have occurred, must have caused more money to get into the accounts of businesses. And the obvious answer is that that is because that money is no longer being paid in the corporate tax. They keep it, they use it in the way that you've described. So you've now reasoned from the end all the way back to the start, and you can check and you can do the forwards reasoning trick to make sure that you've covered all of the steps. And at that point, you can now explain this to the judge. That will be a good, reasonably proven argument, and hopefully it will be credited. So what that means then is that you can often still figure it out, but the mistakes that teams make are that they often think, okay, the policy, I think it will cause this outcome. And then they just stand up and they say, when we abolish the corporate tax, GDP will go up. Here are 5 reasons why that's good. And you've never actually proven the claim in the first place. You haven't stepped through the logic. And so the judge is unlikely to credit it, especially if it gets rebutted or attacked. Or if the judge, for whatever personal reason, doesn't find that intuitive and doesn't understand how it could work, which often happens. So making sure that you do that logical chain and you understand that process will be incredibly valuable to actually proving your case. The last thing that I would say is that you need to identify trade-offs. So generally most debates that get set because the CAs think that there are some arguments on the side affirmative, there's some arguments on side negative, which means that they usually expect that affirmative will win some issues, negative will win some issues as well. And ideally then you want to be able to identify that in prep, which will be very easy if you take that value neutral approach of just asking yourself, what will the policy cause to occur, whether it's good or bad, whether I like it or don't like it. Then that will help you to understand what the other side is likely to run and what they're likely to win on too. So you can ideally then have a conversation towards the end of prep with your team about, okay, I think we should be able to win these issues. Negative might win the other issues. Why is it that our victories on our issues are more important than their victories on their issues? And that is the trade-off where you get some good stuff, you have to deal with some bad stuff too. And making sure to have a conversation about this with your team and having some discussion about why it is that you think this is a trade-off that is worth making, incredibly valuable, because that is the type of work that you're going to need to do often later in the debate, although it's often useful in, for instance, the introduction of the first speaker to spell it out as well. But certainly later in the debate, especially if it is a debate that is close and high quality, you will have to accept the other side is winning some stuff, you're winning some stuff too. Why is it that your victories are outweighing their victories and the judge should side with you? There'll be some debates where you just win every issue, right? Like that's fantastic when it happens. But generally, the most important debates are the closest debates, and those are the ones where the other team is going to win some too. You must have that trade-off clear in your head. So I hope that's helpful. In summary, essentially just make sure that you don't forget about what your setup was and that you understand why it relates to your case and how it strengthens your case. Make sure that you explain the full chain of logic for your case to be credited for each of your arguments. Make sure to have an understanding of what the other side will run and why it is that you think that the trade-off that you're making is one that is good and one that should justify you winning the round. I hope that's been helpful. And if you're going to Easters this year, I hope you have a really good time. Thanks so much.